Hi, I'm Minicozzi. I'm the founder of the Community Breakfast Undoing Racism Day, and I'm here today with Diana Robertson, who's the NAACP president of the Mainline branch. And Diana and I have decided we want to host a show on a regular basis, focusing on civic engagement and interviewing all kinds of people in the community. And the title of the program is called Having Your Say. So it will be an opportunity for you to hear from a number of people in the community on all kinds of topics, but we're especially right now going to have a focus on civic engagement and on voting as we get ready for the election day coming up on November the 6th. And so Diana and I will be hosting, and we have our guest today, our first guest for our Having Your Say program, Anita Friday. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And Anita is the founder of Open Hearts, a Path for Racial Healing. So today we're talking about Constitution Day.
Yes. So September the 17th is Constitution Day. And basically in talking about how the Constitution has framed our government and law in the United States, they decided to celebrate the signing of the Constitution. And so part of what we're going to talk about today is what that means. But before we really get into that, I'd like to ask Anita to tell us a little bit about herself, and then we'll move forward.
Thank you, Diana. So I'm the founder of Open Hearts, a Path for Racial Healing, and I am a retired attorney. Not a constitutional law expert, but I basically am committed to our nation becoming a nation where all individuals have the opportunity to maximize who they are as human beings. I believe when that happens, our nation will be the best that it can be.
Great.
Yeah.
And I know when last year we were celebrating Thurgood Marshall,
Right.
And he had some very interesting things to say about the Constitution. Although he was the first African American Supreme Court justice, but he talked about we know we've had several amendments to the Constitution, and it's only through the amendments that we actually begin to deal with the issue of a government and law for all. So, and that's the beginning process. And so he was very outspoken about that, even though he himself, was a justice, but he was in a position to look at that in a way that impacted everyone.
Right, there's the concept of the Constitution as a living document.
Okay.
And a document which is flexible enough to adjust and accommodate an ever-changing society. That's the beauty of it.
Yes.
Unfortunately, from my perspective, it can also be politicized.
Okay.
The government is set up with three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And all of those functions are created to have a balancing act upon each other, so that there can, again, be that prevailing notion of equity and justice, which is a part of what our nation is.
Yes. And what it's supposed to be. And I was thinking about the fact that when we talk about, I think a lot of times we've forgotten some of the American history we had when we were in school. But we talk about the balance of the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And as part of that understanding that when things are questioned, when there are questions as to the interpretation as to how the law should be interpreted, then ultimately we go to the Supreme Court.
Right. So the way to frame it is the Constitution deals with the broad issues.
Okay.
The legislative branch is supposed to say, okay, here's a concept. So in other words, I like fruit. And the legislature says, okay, we're going to deal with apples. And then there are Fuji apples and Rome apples and maybe something that looks like an apple and it's not an apple.
Okay.
And the Supreme Court says, no, this is an apple.
All right.
And that's kind of the way the three systems are supposed to function.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think what is interesting, because what sometimes people forget as well is that process that leads to having Supreme Court justices that, in fact, are supposed to deal with that interpretation. But as human beings, we all have our biases. We all have things that we are pro and con, and like it or not, those things do seep through opinions and how things are interpreted.
Well, so I mean, if we look at the question of equal protection, you know, early on the Supreme Court was saying that that's okay. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 1800s, there was a question as to whether or not state laws which said that people riding in public transportation, people of color, had to be separate. And the Supreme Court said it's fine so long as it's equal.
Right.
Fast forward to 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. And again, because the Constitution is a living document, the justices said, okay, now we can look at this and say we've got the idea of equal protection, but then is separate but equal really equal?
Right.
And so through time, through understanding, through reflection, the concepts, the broad concepts can be expanded. I think that's what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
And overturn to basically deal with the which happened, and it was as a result of a certain justice that helped in that process. And so when we talk about now that the president actually makes appointments or recommendations, and then it's our U.S. senators who confirm through their process of
and again, that's a part of the
questioning,
balancing, right? You have the executive and the legislative trying to come up with an equitable truth.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so so I guess that kind of brings us into the voting aspect of it, is understanding that if we have the senators who are confirming, then all these, well, at least the senators are elected officials to our government.
Right.
And so to hear about when we go back a little bit, talking about the history of voting, then maybe you could touch on that as far as how it has impacted African Americans.
Sure, and I just want to say that I think the most fundamental thing in the Constitution at all is the right that it gives citizens to vote.
Yes.
However, that was not always the case. There's a whole chronology, property owners, males, and eventually through the 19th Amendment, women were given the right to vote. But what's interesting, and people may not remember, after the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction, a brief period where the federal government said, okay, we are going to enact laws that treat people who had been enslaved as full citizens of this nation. Now, at that time, citizenship and the right to vote applied to men, and black males were given the right to vote in the Constitution through the 15th Amendment. Yay, right? Problem solved. We are good. We've got that equity and justice thing happening. However, at that time, or subsequently, states began, southern states in particular, began enacting legislation in their not in their but in their practices that precluded blacks from voting. For instance, if a black person went to the polls, and again, we're talking from the end of the 1800s to like 1968, when again there were laws that changed things. You would have to count the number of bubbles that could be blown from a jar. blacks were given things like, I don't know, recite the Constitution. And so these tests for access to the right to vote were applied in a discriminatory manner.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and I know we had in '65 when we had the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
So a lot of the laws or amendments to the Constitution still had to be enforced
Right.
by some other form of document.
And I just want to say, even though the voting right, I'm sorry, was enacted in '65, what that did was it said that the federal government again will monitor states that have had this history of discriminatory practices to ensure that there's fair voting. What's interesting, though, is even with judicial and legislative action, there are still things happening which are impeding the rights of people of color to vote. Our state legislators, again, have extensive gerrymandering laws and have drawn districts which dilute black communities in terms of representation. I believe that the presidential election before the most recent one, there's examples of people telling people of color in our communities that they're going to be arrested if they vote, that their votes won't count, that there are people looking for folks who have criminal records and they're precluded from voting. So there have been all sorts of voter suppression efforts that are ongoing despite the Constitution, despite the law. And that's why I'm so glad that you're doing this, because it's imperative that people vote. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, there may be people who think because they have a criminal history that they can't vote. It's not true. It's not true. Now, but that's a form of voter suppression in other jurisdictions.
Right, and that does vary from state to state. Yes, so because we have the state constitutions as well, and those entities such as voting and education and certain other entities, then the state can establish certain laws within the states. But once again, that's how things also end up in the Supreme Court, because then it becomes a question as to what's constitutional.
Right. And as you said before, the voting is so important. And it's important not just on a federal level.
Absolutely.
The districts and the gerrymandering and all of these laws that affect how a person is able to vote are determined by the state.
Right.
And I think oftentimes people say, I'm going to vote, for big national elections, but primaries, local state elections, so important to participate in that process.
Right. And I think they're referencing the terminology is the midterm elections, so those elections that fall in between the presidential, but like you say, starting from the local school boards. Yes.
The dog catcher, right?
There are lots of things that people have to understand, once again, that any position that's an elected position, then it impacts the community. It impacts the policies and laws that will come out of those individuals who govern that particular entity. So whether it's the school board, whether, like you said,
and even very locally, the committee members in your particular ward and precinct, and who the judge of elections is going to be. The judge of elections in the polling place really sets the tenor for how comfortable you feel when you're going into the polling place and how all the rules are followed. We're going to talk about that in the next program that we record. But I wanted to ask another question too, talking about the Constitution as a living document. There's another school of thought, and I wonder what you thought about that, where there are some attorneys or people who are able to have some impact that I interpret the Constitution as it's written. So then that kind of takes out that dynamism, right? So then that,
Well, in order to do that, those individuals would have to ignore hundreds of years of legal precedent. And yeah, that's impossible.
but there's a tension there, isn't there? So there's like a school of people who look at it that way too. So then that's,
Well, let's look at some of the provisions as it's written.
like if the Supreme Court nominee now, Kavanaugh, is talking about Roe v. Wade and saying that sets a precedent, yet
Well,
that's not in the Constitution, so it's hard to know how that's going to play out.
Well, so the Constitution, the terms in the Constitution are very broad-based and subjective. So, as it's written, no person shall be denied. No
Right.
person shall be denied the right to. What is the right to do? What? The right to vote. Well, okay, but you have to register. But you have to be a resident. At some point, you had to own property. At some point, you had to own mail. So how can you say that you're going to be a strict constructionist when the parameters establishing the Constitution are so broad and have been defined through history and as our nation has evolved and people have lived? So I think that, frankly, that's a cop-out. It's sort of like, we'll go back to the good old days. What good old days?
Right, yeah.
When the good old days don't even clearly say,
Right.
other than broad ideals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
And then I think the other part of it, when we talk about the Constitution, and I think earlier we talked a little bit about some of the amendments, and the First Amendment dealing with, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and all of that. People have to understand, and I think it was I don't recall the dates, but I think it wasn't long after the Constitution was written that there had to be the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments came kind of quickly after that. To let you know how there were things missing that were still needed to be interpreted, and so we needed to have these amendments.
And Anne, as to your question, is it a living document or strict construction? Okay, so everyone is entitled to the free exercise of religion.
Right.
Well, that sounds very progressive for people who are not in support of some of the religions that are practiced in our country. That's in contrast to some people who would say that Christianity should be taught and prayer should be taught in classroom. Because again, the free exercise of religion, how do you define that? How do you define religion? And what's ironic in that context is the strict constructionists would probably say, we're a Christian nation, so we want to have prayer in schools, we want Christianity to be a part of everything that we do as a nation. But the Constitution didn't say that.
Right.
So,
and at one time we did have prayer in school. There was prayer in school, and actually the First Amendment was used to say that, not everybody is a Christian.
Right.
And so therefore people have a right, if they're practicing their own religion or worship, experience, that doesn't define everyone as a Christian. And so then you're infringing upon their rights.
which is why it's so important, as we said in the beginning, to have that balance between the legislative, judicial, and executive, and why it's so important for people to vote.
Yes, yes. And to understand that in that voting, going back to the fact that there's still people who are human beings who are making these decisions. So it's very important when we discuss how that plays out to the thought process, and why laws are constantly being changed is because it comes out of the thought processes of the those who are in power at the time
Right.
to make these decisions, and understanding in the case of the Supreme Court that depending upon the age of the person that's appointed, they could be in for 40, 50
Right.
years.
Right.
That's a long time. And that was why even when the case of Plessy versus Ferguson and the Brown versus Board of Education, that it was 64 years
Well, remember,
before that was overturned.
and remember again, you talk about the thinking at the time. At that point in the 1800s, the question was, are black people even human?
Yes.
And so that still is a question in the minds of some people, but I mean, it's an evolving concept.
Right.
So the Supreme Court justice is going to say, of course, we have, or the Supreme Court would say with Plessy versus Ferguson, yeah, because why would this substandard group be with us? So yeah, again, the evolution of the development of humanity.
All right. And talking about the framing of our government from the original Constitution and understanding those who were the original signers of the Constitution, is that there was always incorporated still that concept of power.
Well, they were
And
enslavers.
privilege.
They were enslavers.
Yes.
So, yeah.
So it's going to be hard to say certain things if you're doing the same thing that people are talking about afterwards. But that part is always interesting to me, that there was a terminology in the description of Constitution Day in referencing the framers of our government as brave men, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. They were.
We had.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, they were visionaries, but there was the paradox between economic interests and ideals. One of the things that was a question, the famous 3/5 compromise, and there was tension when our country was being formed between northern representatives and southern representatives, because the way the legislative branch is set up is 2 senators per state, and then based upon population, the congressmen at that time would be elected. And so the northern states were more populous, and the southern states were saying, wait a minute, we're going to be equal okay with respect to the Senate, but you're going to have much more representation than we do in the House. And so the great compromise was that the enslavers said, well, for purpose of representation, our property, well, they're not human, but they're kind of human, so let's count 3/5 of each enslaved person for purpose of determining representation in the House. So again, the hypocrisy, the irony, you're human, you're not human, you're valuable, you're not valuable. You're valuable for my economic empowerment and for my political power. So these great men, what can I say? There's value on all sides.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think, Ann, you were going to...
Well, I had a question. At last year's community breakfast, we focused on the Constitution, and this is putting you on the spot a little bit, but one of the really interesting questions that the panel discussed last year was, if you could add one amendment to the Constitution, what would you add? And it was such an interesting conversation.
That Anita Friday has the right to change, do, and act. Oh, other than that?
So that was easy then.
That was very easy. Let me be the arbiter of all truth. I don't know how my kids would feel about that.
Really. But yeah, that was an interesting
Those are
question.
things that people say.
Yeah.
It ran the gamut. There were about 20 different ideas very
Yes.
quickly. And of course, I can't bring any of them to mind right now. But it was very, there were all kinds of ideas.
I mean, on a serious note, I would do something to make voting mandatory and accessible to everyone.
Okay.
Now, what do you think about voting by mail? They do that in other states. Do you think that would work if we did that nationally, to vote by mail?
There are also states that do electronic voting. You know, and it's funny because I guess on the downside is there's a potential for voter fraud, but then that's been proven to be a myth anyway. I mean, if we have 33% of the population voting, it's not like there are folks running out there to vote twice.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So I think anything that allows or affords greater opportunities for participation is wonderful.
Or even a 2-week window to cast your vote or something like that,
Right.
because having the one day, and I guess it's 14 hours,
And
that's
again,
it.
And again, with as a person of color, the voter suppression, where certain districts closed. I mean, it was in Georgia recently. It was found that polling places in black communities, the head of, and again, why local elections matter, but the person who determined electoral policy in that state closed black voting polls. And it went to the courts, and it had to be undone. But again, you know, the suppression, anything that gets people voting.
Would be good, yeah.
And then the second thing is education. So important for people to be educated. I
Yes.
think.
And to understand, like I said, the importance and the value of voting at every election.
Right.
And so whether you know people or not isn't the question, but as we, especially the NAACP, tries to work on getting more information pieces out that will actually inform our communities as to the different offices that are on the ballot, and in a lot of cases, even if the person's running for the first time, depending upon what the office is, that collecting that information and putting it together, so then it's easy for folks to look at this and say, okay, here's this person's background, here's that person's background, who might be more suitable in this particular instance to vote for, so even when you don't know them, and to try to promote more candidates forums, or the candidates forums that are established and put together to let people know where they're taking place in their community, and to try to get out so that that becomes an opportunity for them to ask questions of the candidates, to get a feel for, is this a person I want to see in this position? And, you know, will they maybe the term is not benefit me, but at least be open to being fair and being accessible as far as holding them accountable.
I mean, one of the other things that I've noted is the whole question of voter apathy, and why don't people vote?
Right.
And as a person of color, what I've said to all of my children who I've taken to the voter booth with me since they were little ones, that people died so that you can vote. And even if you don't have a burning passion about issues or a burning passion about the people who are running, vote in honor of your ancestors who gave their lives so that you could.
That's true. Absolutely. I saw recently a segment in reference to that, and I think that is so critical and so important. So, so it's been nice having you as our first guest.
It's been a pleasure being here. It's been a pleasure being here.
It's a very good way to start the program.
Yes. Yes. And so as folks continue to listen to our different segments, that we hope that you will maybe send us topics that you'd like to hear about, and we'll continue to hopefully have guests that will be able to respond to those topics.
Yep, we can put an email address up at the end of the program. So thank you all for tuning in to Radnor Studio 21 and our new program, Having Your Say. Thank you to Diana and to Anita, and I'm Ann Minicozzi. Thank you.